This is the third of our studies in our series on marriage. This one's called God's Covenant Love. It's really a look at God's love for his people in the books that we call the prophets in the Old Testament. In the first studies, we saw the way God has created marriage, and then we saw the way that the fall entered in and really destroyed relationships. And in a sense, this study is the outworking of the fall in relationships. We see in the Old Testament prophets that God calls himself Israel's husband. He is their God, they are his people, and he loves them with an everlasting love. He loves them as a husband loves his wife. But Israel doesn't treat God with the same love. In fact, Israel rejects their God. But he still loves them. The covenant is not lost. And this study looks at the way that works out in Israel's history.
The definition of covenant in biblical language is essentially when God says to his people, I will be your God and you will be my people. It's an expression of his utmost commitment to his people. God's covenant faithfulness in many ways determines the fact that he will never let his people go. There's a sense in which to let go of his people would in many ways be to let go of himself, such is the way that he sees his relationship with human beings. Essentially, he's saying, you are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. I take you.
Now, we've seen that God says, I take you and you alone. Some would ask the question then from that, why not take many wives? Is it okay in God's eyes to have lots of wives?
Polygamy is excluded by the fact that God is the husband and is faithful to one wife, Israel. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew term beautifully expresses that, Sagala, which means people, Sagala, treasured possession. The people of God's treasured possession. And forsaking all others, keep yourself only for her. When I was 19, I asked a girl out on a date. She looked at me a bit uncomfortably and explained that the next day she and her boyfriend were announcing their engagement. I felt really stupid, like I was stealing a man's sagala, his treasured possession.
We listen in a minute to how God the Father's redeeming grace and direction for our lives is the one true secure foundation for our relationship with him as his people. Do not fear, for you will not be ashamed. Do not be discouraged, for you will not suffer disgrace. For you will forget the shame of your youth, and the disgrace of your widowhood you will remember no more. For your Maker is your husband, the Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer, the God of the whole earth he is called.
The greatest fear that we can have in a marriage relationship is the fear of rejection by our spouses, because we love them so much. When they hurt us, it really runs deep. The greatest form of rejection we can feel is in the case of adultery. One person feels as though their spouse has rejected them for someone else. Is an incredible, painful experience.
We see that rejection is a great problem in relationships. It's a strange thing that we have a great fear of rejection as people, because we're the very ones who have rejected God in our relationship with him. We've said, we don't want you anymore. We don't want to be around you. I actually asked some young people about the subject of rejection. How do they feel that and know that in relationships?
Well, it sucks when you say something that someone, you're like, oh yeah, I really, really like this. And then Steph, because Steph, she says, no, I really don't. You feel like, you're like, oh, or that you say, can I go down to the river and swim with you? And they say, no, I don't want to hang out with you. Yeah. You feel a bit crap.
You're scared of being yourself because you don't want people not to like you.
You always have to worry about what they're thinking about you. It's not fun.
About having no one to sit with at school at lunchtime because you're not cool enough.
You're cool, I'll be your friend.
Me and my girlfriend kind of skirt around the subject because we're both scared of rejection by the other party.
Person. Just get person, mate. Person. Rejection sucks. You never want to be rejected. It's like in an aeroplane. If you're in the aeroplane and you press the ejection button, you go out and then you feel lonely. No, I've got to point to this. You feel lonely on your own and you feel crappy because everyone else is still in the plane and you're not. I have a
If you were to listen to the world, if you were to listen to the media, what our children are fed in schools, you would think that sexuality and its sexual expression is purely a physical act, that it's just something, when people get old enough, it's something that they would do. And so a lot of our young people will actually go out and they will have sex with somebody that they're not married to. And after that, they'll experience all sorts of grief and shame and dirtiness that comes with all of that. The Bible, in speaking about the sexual relationship in a marriage relationship, shows us that in some ways it's like a covenant renewal ceremony. As the husband and wife have been married, they've formed one flesh. The beauty of the sexual act is it's a way, in many ways, just reaffirming that wonderful relationship that they've been brought into, and the height and the passion and the intimacy that is involved in that act in some ways goes beyond even our own experience of it and points to the gospel, where it speaks of God's intimacy and love for us all as well. So to have a sex outside of marriage, in the sense that it's just a physical thing, just something that we do, really sells sex very short, but particularly actually sells our young people short. They're going into something that will ultimately bring grief and sadness if it's not done in the context of marriage.
So when unfaithfulness comes into a relationship, it's a complete turning back of the one flesh union that God designed it to be. God has made us to take one person in a relationship and to treasure them, to honour them, to be intimate and joined to them in that marriage. Adultery is to reject and belittle and shame and hate.
There's a prayer in the marriage service following the vows where it prays for the home of the newly married couple, that there may be peace there, and that peace may be a sign of hope for peace for the whole world. So it's kind of linking together the loving marriage relationship with love for all people, for all our neighbours. We don't worship our own marriage and forget about everybody else. That can be an idolatry too. We treasure our marriage, we treasure our husband and our wife, and we also honour and value all relationships as well.
There's always a problem in relationships when people don't love each other as Jesus would have us do, and we need to learn to treasure and to love each other.
So we said before that God is in a covenant relationship with his people, where he declares to Israel, I will be your God and you will be my people. Such his covenant, passionate faithfulness for them. But the reality is Israel does not love God in the way that God loves Israel. And so Jeremiah the prophet is given words from the Lord to declare to Israel. And we read from Jeremiah 3, Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I choose you, one from a town and two from a clan, to bring you to Zion. So the prophet describes God's relationship with Israel as a husband to a wife. But the reality is he doesn't choose Israel on the basis of Israel's own goodness or Israel's faithfulness to God. In fact, he chooses Israel, who is unfaithful to God.
Jeremiah said, "Like a woman unfaithful to her husband, so you have been unfaithful to me, O house of Israel." You see, God chose her knowing that she would be unfaithful. In fact, it's true to say that God chose her because she was unfaithful. He chose her to redeem her.
Hosea married his wife and she was unfaithful again and again, which meant that Hosea was rejected, belittled and shamed again and again. Can you imagine what this would have been like for him?
Well, I think that sex is really something that is very crucial, I suppose, in our marriage, and one thing that we have promised to really guard in our union. I guess for me, I can't even imagine having that sort of relationship with anyone else, and I would hate to think of anything that would mess with that, just because of the fact that you give everything when you're having sex with your husband. And it's not just about a physical act, it's about, you know, who you are, how you want to love and to comfort and to be one with this person that you have promised to do life with all the time. It's about, you know, even good times, bad times. It's everything really rolled up in one. And sometimes even when you can't really express in words, I mean, when you have a sexual union, I mean, it bridges you over even sometimes very hard times, and you feel rejuvenated, you feel connected, and it's really very precious.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's an amazing thing in that you're most vulnerable, but also very strong, and it's just something that's really special. And it cannot be. It's not something that can be shared out there. It's just a meeting. It's the mind, it's the body, and it's an amazing God-given gift, and just makes us feel really complete, and it's the closest you can get.
Yeah.
So listen to Hosea's pain and anger as he is rejected by his wife. "Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Otherwise I will strip her naked and make her as bare as the day she was born. I will make her like a desert, turn her into a parched land, and slay her with thirst. I will not show my love to her children, because they are the children of adultery. Their mother has been unfaithful and has conceived them in disgrace."
I think it would have been horrible for Hosea.
Well, if I was Hosea, I would be absolutely livid. To have your wife cheat on you would be gut-wrenching. Marriage is about trust and respect and loyalty, and to have your wife prostitute herself out would be unimaginable, and it would be really disgusting and disgraceful, and it's not what marriage is about.
It would hit you at the very core part of who you were.
Because he was incredibly hurt by the person that's meant to be closest to him. And that relationship was destroyed.
And if you're not built up at home in your marriage, where then do you find strength?
Yeah, marriage is about building each other up and trusting each other.
The truth is that the story of Hosea is really only partially about Hosea and his wife. Really, it's the story of God and his people. It's a story in a way in which God has been the faithful God and his people have prostituted themselves. They've turned their backs against God. They've gone after other gods. And it's a story that in some ways communicates to all of Israel just how they've actually turned away from their true husband as an adulterous wife. Now, we might think it's just a word against Israel as well, But if we also recognise that we are in a covenant relationship with a God who deeply loves us, we also need to recognise that when we sin, we actually turn our back on the relationship with the covenant husband that we have, and in many ways we commit adultery as well. So we might say, I would never commit adultery. But in many ways, if we are human beings in a covenant relationship with God and we've turned our back on God, we turn our back on our husband and we become adulterous wives. All have sinned, and therefore every one of us are adulterers.
When a person breaks faithfulness, sins against love, they can't say, oh, don't worry, I won't do that again. They're actually in the hands of the person they have sinned against. They are helpless. They are a repeat offender. And that's the situation that we human beings are in. The whole Old Testament leads us up to that point where something has to happen to deal with the broken relationship with God.
It's only Jesus Christ who can actually remove the selfish streak that's in the heart of every one of us that gets in the way of true, full relationships. And he does that through his death on the cross. And it's when we meet the love of God there that has come to us so powerfully, who are sinners, who are faithless, and yet God's loved us in this way to bring this change in our lives. It wins us over to God and his will, stronger than the greatest temptation, and that actually makes everything completely new. God, through his Spirit, gives us an utterly new life with a new heart, a new desire to love God and to love our neighbours in a true way as well.
So continuing on in Hosea 3, we read this. The Lord said to me, go show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes, which were some sort of a pagan ritual, we expect. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will live with you. We see that although this is talking about Hosea and his wife, that it is also talking about us and God. We are in the place where God has chosen to love us. And yet, as we look to the cross and we see what happened there, we see humanity hating God, being enemies with God. At the cross, we see beating and nailing and abusing and mocking of God himself. Jesus, God's Son, is rejected. And yet, at that same place, we see Jesus saying back, Father, forgive them. We see all of our hatred, all of our shame and guilt being met with pure love from God. We see the God who says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Or this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us. We see our enmity met by the pure love of God, who deals with our sin and deals with all of our pollution and muck through that very act of the cross because of his great love for us.
And this is the love that is reflected in a godly Christian marriage. It's not a love that gets grumpy over the minor issues. It's a love that is able to forgive and able to serve and to move on.
I guess the most frustrating thing I find about marriage is that the other person is so reliant on me, and it's so, total independence doesn't exist in marriage, and I want to go my own way and do my own thing, and that just never works. And like the whole imagery of what God has done is he's brought us together. Like it talks about being one flesh. So when I've been working all day and just I come home and the kids are a bit ratty and Rachel's a bit ratty, and then they expect things of you. And it's like, I don't want to do that. Why should I do that? But then again, I'm reminded of how much Christ has done for me. And, he didn't expect me to do anything, really. He just went ahead and did it. And that love and that full forgiveness that comes from, that relationship of serving others only makes sense in him and in marriage. Otherwise, it's just, a load of waffle. And it's really hard work. That's not saying it's not hard work, but when I'm laying on the couch after a long day and I see all these dishes piled up, and I know I should get up and help my wife. Sometimes I'm like, nah, why should I? And then I'm just reminded of what, it's only dishes, but I'm just reminded of what, Jesus has done. So why can't I just get up and do the dishes for my wife?
Yeah.
So,
Why can't you?
and I do sometimes. And other times my sinfulness is just like, nah, and pride. But at the end of the day, he's my motivator, and not trying to, live up to my wife's expectations. And it's really hard to live up to other people's expectations. But when you see what Christ has done for us, for me personally, I owe him everything. And he willingly done it. So why wouldn't I do that for my wife?
We have disagreements, and then we're both angry at each other. We don't talk to each other, and I don't want to talk. I don't even want to make up. And we know the only way that we'll ever be alright or talk to each other is to pray about it, even though we don't want to. Well, I don't. And I don't want to. Yeah, but it's the only way. And it really does work. Yeah.
So in a marriage, there are two sinners. There's a husband and a wife. And God forgives and accepts the sinful husband, and he forgives and accepts the sinful wife. That means it's also possible for the husband to accept the sinful wife and the wife to accept the sinful husband. I think what happens is that this means that forgiveness is always possible to us. What happens is we sometimes close ourselves off from that possibility. It's really the same thing with love too. We feel the limitation of our love. We are like rusty, leaky rainwater tanks. God's a fountain of living water. And when we're in relationship with him, we can know that ceaseless supply ourselves. And we can feel empty, we can feel dry, we can feel unable to love anyone. And God floods us with his fountain of living water, which is his love, and we can love.
So back to Hosea.
Mm-hmm.
He, in the story, is reunited with Gomer. She comes back and they experience a proper marriage, a faithful marriage with one another. And Hosea finally gets to love like God loves. He loves her unconditionally. He loves her as a husband should love his wife. So it's a wonderful, fulfilling thing for Hosea.
Yeah, and out of all the mess, Gomer gets to understand real and true love, just as God really and truly loves us. She understands true love through the forgiveness of her husband and his love for her.
I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and I hate a man's covering himself with violence, as well as with his garment, says the Lord Almighty. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and do not break faith. The point is that in the grace of God, which we have seen, God didn't have to break his relationship with us. He had the power in his grace to renew it. And we are to understand in all of our relationships, and especially in marriage, that we have the power of his grace, not to have to break the relationship, but to work to renew it.
In Malachi, this call to let grace renew the relationship is not just a call to the faithful one, it's also a call to those who have been faithless. they have no excuse to go on sinning just because grace has come, but they're actually called to, in that grace, to live in that grace and to renew the relationship. They have no excuse to go on sinning deliberately, but they try to love God despite their failures.
So I guess in my personal life and in my family and also in the workplace, I've seen the pain and the damage and the destructiveness of divorce, and how there's just nothing good about it. Nobody wins. It destroys families financially. It destroys people emotionally, and it's all, I guess, because I've seen that, I'm all very much don't allow that to become a part of our language. Very early on in our marriage, we learned, I guess, when we, you could call it an argument, but they were fights, that we would fight about what we were fighting about. We wouldn't build up an account of wrongs and, and last week you did this, and we'll just, if that started, the other person would just shut it down. No, we don't do that. So that language of relationship was very much, well, we need to sort this thing out.
I was lucky enough to enjoy a family life where I never really thought it would ever happen that my parents would split up, and divorce wasn't as common back then. And I remember there's that security that I never really had to worry about if my parents did disagree, that it would go anywhere, and there would be, there was never that fear hanging over us, and that was just such a freedom in that. And one of our children came or spoke to us once that, are you and Dad going to get divorced or something, or will you always be together? Because one of his friends had parents separated, and we said, no, that's not part of our thinking. That's not an option for us. We've promised to be together forever, and it's a good thing, that security that we have and that our kids have.
In Malachi, this call to let grace renew the relationship is not just about the one who has been faithful. It's also about the one who has been unfaithful. The call is to that one or that nation too. You see, there's no excuse just because there's grace to go on sinning. So the unfaithful ones are called to be faithful.
In the book of Revelation, we get this glorious picture of a bride who has been prepared and made holy and clean and ready for her marriage. In this way, we see that Jesus has cleansed his bride. He has purified her guilt. He has restored her relationship bonding power. She has her sticky back in her relationships. And so she can enter fully and beautifully into that marriage. She is a restored bride.
So we finish our study on the prophets, seeing that there has been a great battle for marriage and for perfect relationships. And although there's been this great battle, God has prevailed. In the end, he has won that battle, and he has brought back his beloved to himself. His love is the only thing that has brought the full restoration to relationships, and we look to the future when Jesus will actually bring all of that into being.